The sun beat down with an unrelenting fury, baking the New Mexico territory into a cracked ochre canvas. For Elias Thorne, a man whose face was etched with the lines of solitary years and the harsh kiss of the elements, this desolate expanse was both his prison and his sanctuary. His ranch, a collection of weathered wood and dusty corrals, stood as a lone sentinel against the vast, indifferent sky. He was riding back, the rhythmic creak of his saddle a familiar lullaby, checking fences that seemed to stretch into infinity. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind, the distant, mournful lowing of his Herefords, and the ceaseless dance of dust devils across the parched earth. Elias preferred this quiet, predictable rhythm of survival. Then the rhythm shattered. Nestled precariously against a cluster of gnarled mesquite bushes, near the skeletal remains of what was once a riverbed, a small, still form lay slumped. Elias reined in his horse, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. It was a girl, no older than 10, perhaps 12, her small frame swallowed by oversized, grimy clothes. Her face was streaked with dirt and dried tears, but it was her eyes that truly arrested him, wide, fathomless pools of terror that Elias, a man who had seen his share of frontier brutality, rarely encountered with such intensity. What truly made his blood run cold, however, was her mouth. It was crudely sewn shut, with thick, dark thread, a grotesque parody of a smile. Clutched in her small, trembling hand was a piece of worn wood, fashioned into a tag. Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry, brittle earth, and carefully took the tag. Carved roughly into its surface were 3 words that seemed to mock the endless silence of the plains. Silence is golden. Elias, a man who found comfort in the predictable routines of his ranch and the stoic company of his animals, felt a profound disquiet settle over him. He couldn't leave her. With a gruff tenderness, he lifted her small, light body and carried her back to his isolated ranch. The ride back was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the mournful groans of his saddle leather and the girl's shallow, ragged breaths. Once inside his crude cabin, he set about carefully cleaning her wounds. His calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, he offered her water, which she sipped weakly, and a meager plate of stew that she struggled to eat, her sewn lips a constant, agonizing reminder of her plight. He tried to speak to her, his voice rougher than usual, but received only silent, haunted stares. The immediate challenge was her physical state, her gauntness, the unyielding stitches, but the profound, unsettling mystery of her appearance and the ominous tag hung like a shroud over his simple life. Who was she? Who could commit such a monstrous act? And why was she left here, in the middle of nowhere? Days bled into a week, each sunrise painting the desert sky with fiery hues, but the nights brought a chilling quiet. The girl, whom Elias, with his pragmatic simplicity, tentatively named Willow for her slender, almost fragile vulnerability, began to show tiny, almost imperceptible signs of life. She started to eat with slightly more consistency, though always with a haunting, watchful quietness, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings. Elias, despite the hardened shell he had built around himself over years of solitary living, found his routines subtly shifting to accommodate her. He'd leave food and fresh water easily accessible, and through slow, deliberate gestures, he began to teach her small, practical tasks around the ranch, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, stacking firewood. He noticed her small acts of quiet defiance, a stubborn set to her jaw when a task was difficult, a fleeting flash of determination in her eyes that belied the terror that still clung to her. The sewn lips remained a constant, stark reality. Elias, with his rudimentary medical knowledge gleaned from patching up injured livestock and his own occasional scrapes, knew better than to attempt to remove the stitches himself. The risk of infection, or worse, was too great. He was a rancher, not a healer. He also observed her profound, almost animalistic fear of any approaching outsider. When the rare dust cloud on the horizon signaled a lone rider, perhaps a traveling peddler or a prospector, Willow would vanish, melting into the shadows of the barn or the sparse cover of the rocks, remaining hidden until the stranger was a distant speck once more. It became painfully clear that her silence was not merely a physical affliction, but a deep-seated, agonizing psychological wound, a cage forged by fear. She began to communicate with Elias through simple, often crude drawings in the dirt, stick figures that conveyed fragments of her ordeal, a wagon, a long journey, the distinct outline of a looming, shadowy figure, and always the desperate flight. Against every fiber of his solitary being, Elias felt a nascent, fierce protective instinct begin to bloom within him. He started leaving his Winchester closer at hand, its worn wood a comforting weight. His gaze lingered on the distant horizons more often, scanning for anything amiss. He understood, with a chilling certainty, that whoever had done this to Willow might still be out there, hunting for her. His isolated ranch, once his impenetrable sanctuary, might now be a vulnerable target. The quiet, predictable life he had cultivated for so long was irrevocably shattered, replaced by an uneasy vigilance, a constant tension humming beneath the surface. The simple act of caring for Willow was slowly, inexorably, eroding his stoic detachment, forcing him to confront not only her profound pain, but also his own buried humanity, stirring emotions he thought long dead. Willow's silent presence, though initially a burden, began to unravel Elias's carefully constructed isolation in unexpected ways. Her drawings, initially fragmented and hesitant, became increasingly detailed and coherent. They hinted at a life before the trauma, a family, a sturdy wagon, and then a sudden brutal disruption. Most chillingly, she repeatedly drew a man with a distinctive jagged scar across his cheek, a figure she clearly feared above all else, his crude likeness radiating a palpable sense of menace. Elias, with each new drawing, began to piece together the horrific fragments of her ordeal, understanding that Willow wasn't simply an abandoned orphan, but a survivor of something truly unspeakable. The chilling message on the tag, "Silence is golden," now echoed with a sinister new meaning, a chilling warning, a powerful threat, a decree of control. One blustery afternoon, the very air seemed to thicken with foreboding. A single rider approached the ranch, not the harmless peddler or curious prospector. This was a lean, hard-faced man, his eyes like chips of flint, and unmistakably a jagged scar slashed across his cheek, precisely as Willow had drawn him. Willow, who had been quietly scattering feed for the scrawny chickens, froze mid-motion, her eyes widening with a raw, unadulterated terror that stole her breath. She instinctively tried to melt into the shadows, but it was too late. The man's gaze, cold and assessing, swept over the ranch, paused for a fraction of a second on the girl before settling on Elias. He introduced himself as Silas Blackwood, his voice smooth as polished stone, but with an underlying current of steel. He claimed to be a tracker, looking for a runaway orphan, his words carefully chosen, yet his eyes held a cold, predatory glint. Elias, relying on years of frontier intuition and his uncanny ability to size up dangerous men, knew instantly that this was no ordinary tracker. He lied, his voice gruff but steady, claiming he hadn't seen anyone matching the description. But the tension in the air was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Silas lingered, his gaze constantly darting, his eyes flicking towards the hidden girl, who remained a trembling shadow behind Elias. Elias felt a primal, almost overwhelming urge to protect Willow, a surge of protective strength he hadn't realized he possessed. The encounter was brief, lasting only a few agonizing minutes, but it left Elias with a chilling, undeniable certainty. Silas Blackwood was the man from Willow's drawings, the architect of her terror, and he was here for her. The quiet ranch, once a haven of solitude, had now become the unwitting stage for a dangerous confrontation, forcing Elias to make a stand against a brutal past that was not his own, but had now become inextricably linked to his very destiny. The chilling encounter with Silas Blackwood ignited a fierce, unyielding protectiveness in Elias. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he couldn't face Silas alone indefinitely, nor could he keep Willow hidden forever. His isolated ranch, once his greatest strength, was now a potential trap. He had to act. He made the difficult decision to ride into Redemption Gulch, the nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble frontier town notorious for its transient population, its dusty saloon, and its few, often dubious, sources of information. He desperately needed supplies, but more importantly, he needed to unearth the truth about Silas Blackwood. Leaving Willow at the ranch, armed with his trusty Winchester and strict instructions to stay hidden, Elias set off. The ride was tense, his senses heightened, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. Redemption Gulch was a cacophony of sounds. The clinking of glasses from the saloon, the coarse laughter of card players, the creak of wagon wheels, and the low murmur of desperate men. Dust swirled perpetually in the streets, coating everything in a fine, gritty layer. Elias moved discreetly, his weathered face revealing little. He started his inquiries in the grimy saloon, where whispered conversations were easier to come by. Through hushed tones and wary glances, he began to piece together the chilling puzzle. Silas Blackwood, the name itself, evoked a shiver of fear, was a ruthless bounty hunter, known not only for his relentless pursuit of targets, but also for his unspeakable, brutal methods. Whispers connected him to a horrifying series of disappearances. Entire families, often with young girls, who had vanished without a trace after crossing Silas's path. There were dark rumors of a sinister trade, a network stretching across the frontier, and the chilling phrase, "Silence is golden," was rumored to be Silas's personal, horrifying signature, a silent warning to his victims and anyone foolish enough to interfere. Elias also managed to find Doc Miller, an old, weary man whose eyes held the profound sadness of one who had witnessed too much of the West's inherent cruelty. Elias, choosing his words with immense care, described Willow's condition in vague terms, avoiding any mention of her location. Doc Miller, his face etched with weariness, confirmed the severity of the act, explaining the immense risks of infection and the profound psychological trauma such a mutilation would inflict. He told Elias that removing the stitches would require incredibly delicate hands and specialized tools, knowledge far beyond Elias's capabilities. More importantly, he confirmed that such an act was not merely an injury, but a deliberate attempt to silence, to erase, to exert absolute control over another human being. Elias returned to the ranch under the cloak of night, his heart heavy with the crushing weight of Willow's brutal past, but also hardened by a grim, unyielding determination. He knew now that he wasn't just protecting a lost girl, he was protecting her right to exist, her fundamental right to a voice. The final confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. Silas Blackwood, relentless in his pursuit and cunning in his tactics, reappeared at the ranch days later, no longer bothering with the pretense of a search. This time, he brought a small, rough gang with him, their presence a menacing testament to his unwavering, brutal intent. He dismounted, his scarred face a mask of cold determination, and demanded the girl, his voice devoid of any human emotion, stating simply that she was property. Elias, his weathered Winchester clutched firmly in his hands, stood his ground. He was a rancher, a man of the land, not a gunfighter by trade, but his resolve was now as unyielding as the granite mountains that ringed his property. He had a debt to pay, not to the girl directly, but to his own conscience, to the burgeoning sense of justice that Willow's presence had awakened within him. A tense standoff unfolded, a battle of wills played out under the vast, indifferent sky. The dusty wind whipped around them, kicking up stinging grit as words escalated to chilling threats, and threats inexorably spiraled into violence. Elias, relying on his intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain and his deep-seated instinct for survival, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and newfound purpose. He was aided by a surprising turn. Two of his longtime ranch hands, men he had always kept at a respectable distance, recognizing the profound injustice unfolding before them, chose to stand with him against Blackwood's ruthless crew. Their quiet loyalty, forged in the crucible of this confrontation, was a testament to Elias's quiet integrity. The fight was brutal, a desperate struggle for survival, but Elias and his unexpected allies, driven by a shared, unspoken sense of what was right, ultimately prevailed. Silas Blackwood, the chilling embodiment of silent terror, the architect of Willow's pain, was finally defeated. In the weary aftermath, Doc Miller, whom Elias had managed to convince to make the arduous journey to the isolated ranch, worked with painstaking care. With his specialized tools and years of grim experience, he slowly, meticulously removed the coarse stitches from Willow's lips. The pain was immense, a searing fire, but she endured it with a quiet, astonishing strength that belied her small frame. For days after, she remained silent, physically scarred, but finally free from her physical bond. Then one crisp, quiet morning, as Elias was saddling his horse for his daily rounds, he heard it. A small, raspy sound, then another, almost like a fledgling bird testing its wings. Willow, tentatively, with immense effort, uttered her first word, "Thank you." It was a fragile, barely audible sound, barely a whisper carried on the wind. But to Elias, it was the most beautiful, resonant sound he had ever heard, a beacon of fragile hope in the vast, unforgiving plains. It was a testament to the profound power of human connection, the unwavering courage of a child, and the fundamental, unyielding right of every soul to finally find its own voice. The ranch remained isolated, but it was no longer silent, now subtly imbued with the fragile yet vibrant promise of a new, uncertain future.